The first night alone in my new apartment was supposed to be a milestone, a true step into adulthood. After years of saving and planning, I'd finally found a place that felt like it was worth the wait. It was an older building, charming and unique, though it was clear the place hadn't seen much upkeep in a while. But I loved the character it had. High ceilings, hardwood floors, even a small, unused fireplace in the living room. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Levin, had warned me about occasional noises, saying the building was settling. "Nothing unusual in a place this age," he said with a shrug. That first evening, I felt on top of the world. I unpacked slowly, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled onto the couch with a book. But as I was starting to drift into sleep, I heard something strange. It was a soft, steady thudding, almost like the beat of a drum, faint but unmistakable. I sat up, alert, listening hard. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls, traveling slowly, almost rhythmically. I convinced myself it was probably just the pipes or the heater kicking in, old building quirks as the landlord had warned. But then, as the night went on, the sound grew louder. It was no longer random or inconsistent, but deliberate, almost like footsteps. They echoed faintly through the walls, pacing down the hallway, stopping just outside my bedroom. I held my breath, straining to hear. For a long moment, there was silence. But then, softly, as if someone were pressing their lips to the wall just outside, I heard a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, urgent. I froze in bed, every nerve in my body tense, listening as the whisper repeated, rising and falling. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, that I was tired, that I needed to sleep. But in the morning, the memory of that voice haunted me. The words had seemed so close, so desperate. I told myself it was all in my head, and brushed it off. But later that day, when my friend Kara came over, I casually mentioned the sounds. She laughed it off, saying I was just spooked from moving in alone, but I could see a hint of worry in her eyes. That evening, after we ordered takeout and settled down to watch a movie, I started to feel better. Having someone there with me was reassuring. But as the night wore on, I noticed Kara kept glancing at the hallway, her face growing pale. Finally, she turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her face tense. I strained to listen, and sure enough, the footsteps were back, soft and deliberate, creeping down the hallway. And then came that whisper, faint but unmistakable, from inside the wall. The voice was pleading, begging. I glanced at Kara, trying to play it off. "It's probably just the pipes," I said, forcing a laugh. But deep down, I knew it was something more. After Kara left, I was alone again, and the sounds grew louder. The footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, moving back and forth outside my bedroom door. And then, right as I thought they'd fade, the voice came back, louder this time, desperate. "Let me in," it whispered over and over again. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my phone. I dialed the landlord, feeling ridiculous, but desperate. He picked up after a few rings, sounding groggy. "Yeah?" he muttered. I took a breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mr. Levin, I keep hearing noises, like footsteps, and someone whispering. Is there a way to check if someone's been in the building?" There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him rolling his eyes through the phone. "Listen, it's an old building," he said. "Pipes make noise. Walls creak. Give it a few days, you'll get used to it." I wanted to believe him, so I tried to ignore the sounds, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But each night, the noises grew louder, more insistent, until I was barely sleeping. The footsteps grew heavier, as if whatever was on the other side of the wall was growing bolder, angrier. The whispers turned to pleas, then to frantic, feverish demands. "Let me in, let me out." One night, after nearly a week of sleeplessness, I snapped. I yelled back at the voice, telling it to leave me alone, my voice echoing through the empty apartment. There was a long, chilling silence, and then I heard it. Laughter. It was hollow and eerie, echoing through the walls. I bolted from my bed, heart pounding, and locked myself in the bathroom, praying for it to stop. After what felt like an eternity, the laughter faded, and I was left in silence. For a few days, the noises stopped, and I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it had all been some strange quirk of the old pipes. But one evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The whisper was back, but this time, it was coming from inside the fireplace. I could hear it, faint and desperate, pleading again. "Please let me out," it begged, over and over. I crept toward the fireplace, my hands shaking. As I peered into the darkness, I noticed something strange. A narrow seam along the back wall, barely visible in the dim light. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it inside, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Behind the wall, I saw a small, dark space, almost like a hidden crawl space. And in that darkness, something moved. I caught a glimpse of a hand, pale and skeletal, clawing at the narrow opening. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, and ran out of my apartment, heart racing. I called the police, trying to explain that someone, or something, was trapped in the walls. They arrived quickly and searched the apartment, but found nothing. They told me the crawl space didn't exist, that the building structure wouldn't allow for it. But as they left, one of the officers lingered, looking uneasy. "You know, this building used to be a boarding house back in the early 1900s, he said quietly. "Legend has it that a woman went missing here, one of the tenants. Some people say she was locked away by her husband, left to die in the walls." I shivered, feeling the weight of his words. The officer shrugged and left, but his story haunted me. I moved out the next day, unable to shake the memory of that voice, that desperate plea. A few weeks later, as I was unpacking in my new apartment, I found an old photo I hadn't remembered packing. It was a sepia-toned image of a woman, pale and thin, her eyes hollow. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Let me out." To this day, I don't know if the voice was real or if I'd lost my mind, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, a faint whisper, echoing from somewhere just beyond the walls. When my parents decided to leave town for a month-long vacation, they asked me to house sit. They'd bought a sprawling, old Victorian house a few years back and had spent nearly every weekend since fixing it up. I loved the place, with its grand staircase, high ceilings, and stained glass windows. But something about it was always a little unsettling, especially since they'd started telling me about the strange happenings in the house. Flickering lights, doors creaking open, and cold drafts that seemed to appear out of nowhere. My mom said it was just the charm of an old house, and I tried to believe her. The first couple of nights alone went smoothly. I enjoyed the quiet and had even gotten used to the odd creaks and groans of the house settling. I spent my evenings sprawled out on the couch with a bowl of popcorn, binge-watching old horror movies. Ironically, I wasn't spooked at all until the third night. That night, as I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard something strange. It was soft at first, just a gentle rustling, like fabric brushing against the wall. I brushed it off as my imagination, maybe even a distant car driving by, but the sound grew louder, more persistent. It started to sound like footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom, then moved down the hall and faded into silence. I waited, every muscle tense, but nothing else happened. Telling myself it was just the old house settling, I eventually managed to fall back asleep. But the next morning, I found something odd. My parents had a small, antique table in the hallway just outside my room. They always kept a heavy, silver candlestick on it as a decoration. But this morning, the candlestick was gone. I searched everywhere for it, but it was nowhere to be found. I brushed it off as absent-mindedness. Maybe I'd moved it without remembering. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as I was watching TV in the living room, I felt a sudden chill. It was the kind of deep cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I glanced around, but all the windows were shut tight. Then I noticed something even stranger. The front door was ajar, just an inch, as if someone had been standing there, listening before slipping back out. I shivered, telling myself I must not have closed it properly, and went over to lock it firmly this time. Just as I was heading back to the couch, I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time from the second floor. They were heavier than before, deliberate and slow. My heart pounded as I realized the footsteps were tracing a path back and forth in my parents' bedroom directly above me. I grabbed my phone and called my mom, feeling ridiculous, but needing to hear her voice. She laughed it off, saying, "You're just letting that big, old house get to you. There's no one up there, honey. It's probably just the pipes." Feeling a bit silly, I agreed and tried to calm myself down. I turned on every light on the first floor and settled back on the couch. But when I heard a faint scraping noise coming from the basement, I froze. It was a rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged along the floor. I stared at the door to the basement, barely breathing, until the noise stopped. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. "Forgot to mention, there's a key under the kitchen mat for the neighbor, in case anything goes wrong. Keep it there just in case." I almost laughed, feeling a strange sense of relief. Of course, that explained everything. Maybe the neighbor had come by to check on the house, seen the door open, and decided to investigate. I just missed him. That had to be it. But then I remembered, I hadn't seen anyone coming or going. And the scraping sound from the basement. How would the neighbor even get down there without me seeing him? Suddenly, I felt foolish for trying to rationalize it. Still, I decided to check. I walked over to the basement door and, with a shaky hand, opened it. The steps leading down were cloaked in darkness, and the cold, musty smell hit me immediately. I fumbled for the light switch but hesitated. Deep down, I didn't want to know what was down there, but curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. I flicked on the light, and it buzzed to life, casting dim, flickering light over the stairs. Slowly, I descended, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But halfway down, I stopped. Something was wrong. There, at the bottom of the stairs, was the missing silver candlestick, lying on its side, as if someone had dropped it there in a hurry. I stared at it, my mind racing. No one else had been in the house. I'd been locking the doors. So how did it get down here? I turned to go back up, but as I did, I heard a soft shuffling sound behind me, like someone brushing up against the wall. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized I wasn't alone in the basement. Panicking, I dashed up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and locked it. For the rest of the night, I sat on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting, listening. Every creak and groan of the house felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to move. The next morning, exhausted but determined, I decided to investigate further. I started combing through my parents' belongings, looking for any sign that might explain the strange occurrences. That's when I found an old notebook, wedged between two books in my mom's study. It was a journal, my mom's, from just after they'd bought the house. One entry caught my attention immediately. She'd written about a strange smell in the basement, something that wouldn't go away no matter how many times they cleaned. She'd also mentioned seeing things out of the corner of her eye. Shadows that moved, objects that disappeared and reappeared in odd places. My dad had dismissed her concerns, but she'd written about feeling like she wasn't alone in the house. There, scrawled in her handwriting, was a final entry. "I swear I saw someone today. A man, just standing at the top of the stairs. I thought it was just my imagination, but then he turned and walked away. When I went to check, there was no one there. But I know what I saw. I'm not imagining this." I dropped the journal, my hands shaking. My mom had seen him too. That night, I decided to stay awake, to catch whatever or whoever was tormenting me. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, this time directly above me in the living room. They stopped, then started again, pacing back and forth. I called the police, finally admitting to myself that I wasn't safe. 2 officers arrived, and I let them in, explaining the situation in a shaky voice. They searched the entire house, even the basement, but found no signs of anyone. Just as they were leaving, one of the officers stopped, frowning. "You say you've been hearing these sounds all week?" I nodded, feeling a bit foolish. "Well," he continued, "it's not the first time we've had calls about this house. I looked it up on the way here. The previous owner was an old man, kept to himself. He disappeared actually right before your parents bought the place. Never found him. The other officer nudged him, and they both left, but his words stayed with me. For days, I kept hearing those footsteps, that dragging noise, even the occasional soft whisper. I eventually left, refusing to stay alone in that house ever again. My parents returned from their trip, and I told them everything, even showed them my mom's journal. My mom was disturbed, but said she hadn't experienced anything in months. Just last week, I got a text from my mom late at night. I heard him again, footsteps in the hallway. What should we do? All I could respond was, get out. But they didn't leave. They kept brushing off the strange happenings as house noises and said they'd become used to it. Finally, after one particularly unsettling night, when my mom heard someone whisper her name from the basement, they decided to call in a professional. A paranormal investigator arrived the next day. He walked through the house, his face growing more tense by the minute. When he reached the basement, he paused at the top of the stairs, inhaling sharply. After a moment, he turned back to my parents and said, "You're not alone here. There's something residual." He explained that old houses often carried energies from their past, but this one felt different. "He doesn't know he's dead," the investigator said. "He thinks he's still in his home, pacing, waiting for someone to listen." My parents looked at each other, finally acknowledging that they'd felt the presence all along. They held a small ceremony, lighting candles in each room, acknowledging the spirit and asking him to let go. The investigator said it might take time, but if they made peace with the presence, the energy would eventually settle. That night, for the first time, the house was silent. A few days later, my mom texted me again, this time with a picture. The hallway, lit only by the moon, completely still. She wrote, "He's gone finally." As unsettling as it was, I felt an odd sense of relief. Maybe the man had just needed someone to notice him, to know that he was there, lost between life and death. Now that he was finally seen, he could rest. Since then, they haven't heard a single creak or step out of place. I just moved into my new apartment, a place I found cheap on a listing site. It was in an old building with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but I was on a budget and wasn't about to be picky. The landlord was a quiet, older man who didn't ask a lot of questions, just gave me the keys and mentioned one thing. "If you hear anything strange, it's an old building. Just try to ignore it." He gave a quick, nervous smile, but I thought nothing of it. On my first night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed a dark, oddly shaped stain on the ceiling directly above where I'd be sleeping. It looked like water damage, but different. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just a quirk of the place. But the more I looked at it, the more it seemed like it wasn't a random stain. It was oddly defined, almost like a face. I could almost make out eyes and a mouth, frozen in what looked disturbingly like a scream. Trying to brush off the uneasy feeling creeping over me, I turned off the lights and got into bed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But that night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, tap, 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 like something dripping from the ceiling. I turned on my phone flashlight, aiming it up at the ceiling, and my stomach dropped. The stain seemed darker, the shape of the face even clearer. There was a slow, rhythmic drip of something from the mouth of the face, splattering onto the bed below. Dreading what I'd find, I reached up and touched a small drop on my pillow, and my fingers came away red. I froze. Blood. It was blood dripping from the ceiling, right from the mouth of that twisted face. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, not sure if I should leave or stay, when I heard a scratching noise. It was coming from above, like someone, or something, clawing from the other side of the ceiling, trying to get through. The face on the ceiling seemed to almost bulge, pressing downward like it was pushing against a thin barrier, trying to break through. The mouth stretched wider, and as it did, the blood dripped faster. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and dialed the landlord's number. He picked up after the third ring, sounding annoyed, but as soon as I told him about the stain, about the blood, he went silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hesitant. "I told her to leave him alone," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "She wouldn't listen. She kept provoking him, saying she didn't believe. They never found her." But he trailed off, but I couldn't stay silent. "What do you mean? Who? What's going on?" I demanded. He sighed, as if weighing whether he should tell me. Finally, he said, "The woman who lived there before you. She was curious, kept asking about strange noises and stains. She thought it was just a story, something to laugh about. But one night, she vanished, and after that, well, no one wanted that apartment. Stayed empty for a while. I thought maybe he'd gone." I felt my stomach churn. "What do you mean, gone? Who is he?" But he just whispered, "It doesn't matter. He won't leave." The phone went dead, and I was left standing there in the dimly lit room, feeling utterly alone. The scratching sound from above grew louder, almost frantic, and I could hear something like breathing, coming in shallow, wheezing gasps. The stain on the ceiling seemed to pulse, like something pressing hard from the other side. I knew I couldn't stay another second. I grabbed my coat and ran out the door, barely remembering to lock it behind me. I spent the night in my car, too terrified to go back inside. The next morning, I went back with the intention of packing up and getting out. But when I stepped inside, I looked up and saw that the stain was gone. No blood, no face, just an ordinary, cracked ceiling. It was as if the entire thing had been a nightmare. The landlord called that afternoon. "Did you hear anything else last night?" he asked, sounding cautious. I hesitated, but something in me made me lie. "No, nothing at all." He sighed, as if relieved. "Good. It's best to keep it that way." I moved out that evening, leaving most of my belongings behind. I still think about that face, those blood-stained eyes staring down at me. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed longer, if the face would have broken through, and what it was trying so desperately to escape from on the other side.